Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Steve Cohen. I'm on the faculty here, and I'm the director of this session's three organizers: the Earth Institute's research program on sustainability policy and management, the Masters of Sustainability Management program in the School of Professional Studies, and the MPA in Environmental Science and Policy program at the School of International Public Affairs, all here at Columbia University. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event, which is entitled The Financial Ecosystem, the Role of Finance in Achieving Sustainability. Tonight, we're celebrating something, the publication of a new book by my friends and colleagues, Professor Satyajit Bose and Guodong, and their colleague, Ann Simpson. I'm sorry to say that Guodong can't join us here tonight as he went home to China to celebrate the Lunar New Year and is, I think, still celebrating, but he can't come back. And he's not here now, and if he were, I'd give him a hard time for how long it took him and Satyajit to actually get the book done. But it's an excellent book, and I commend it to everybody here. It's really an instant classic. We asked Dong to write a few words, which will be shared shortly by our Earth Institute colleague, Kelsie DeFrancia. Ann Simpson could also not attend tonight due to travel restrictions set by her employer, and she'll be represented by her colleague, Vonda Bernstein, from the SEIU Pension Fund. While it took a while to complete, possibly because of the time and effort it required to produce such an excellent work, these three authors have produced something that's really essential reading if you're interested in how finance can be leveraged to advance sustainability. It provides practical tools and specialized data sources that are critical to the important goal of increasing social responsibility in all of our economic activity. Bose, Dong, and Simpson have collaborated on an important and path-breaking work. You're going to be hearing about this book for a long time. We're seeing growing attention paid to the term sustainable finance, both here at Columbia University and it's slowly creeping down Broadway toward Wall Street. Financial markets are the primary directors of investments and economic activity in a capitalist global society. But they also have an important societal role to play, channeling capital to investment opportunities that are beneficial to natural and human ecosystems. Behavior is influenced by the availability and price of capital finance, and sustainability factors must be reflected in the world as understood by the finance professionals in order to be real and not merely symbolic. If it doesn't get down to finance, it's not real. Green finance involves directing capital toward sustainability businesses and infrastructure, accounting for the risks posed by climate change, and ensuring that investments serve to protect rather than destroy our planet. In the research program on sustainability policy and management that Professor Bose and I and Professor Dong and Kelsie are involved in, we're working with the investment management and corporate sectors to highlight sources of sustainability-related risks and opportunities into the analysis of capital deployment, as well as developing methods of analyzing environmental, social, and governance factors and bringing them into routine due diligence and financial analysis to make sure that sustainability is not an extraneous factor, but an integral factor. We're working with one of our panelists tonight at Alliance Bernstein to connect investments in emerging markets to social impacts. I also see a growing interest in sustainable finance by investment professionals and by my own students, which are sure indications that we're in the midst of a meaningful economic transition. In fact, here at Columbia, we offer a certification in sustainability finance, which we've been expanding, and we'll start offering online this September as part of a hybrid program where you come in for a few days and there's a residential piece, but all of the rest of the learning is done through online courses. Now tonight, we have a panel of experts who are going to explore areas where financial knowledge has been harnessed to the goal of combining monetary return with long-run sustainability, new research around environmental, social, and governance integration and climate risk, and mobilizing financial resources to meet the critical United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to start by introducing, despite her absence, one of our book's authors, Anne Simpson. Anne is the director of the Board of Governance and Strategy at CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System, where she's responsible for strategic initiatives across the $400 billion fund. These include Climate Action 100 Plus, a global investor alliance of over $35 trillion driving business action on climate change. She serves on a number of boards and councils and was recognized by Time magazine as one of 15 women globally leading the fight on climate change. And I'm sorry that she's not here with us tonight to inspire us. She is, however, represented by her good colleague, Vonda Bernstein, from the SEIU Pension Fund. Vonda works with the Initiative for Responsible Investment at the Center for Public Leadership of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. You've probably heard of that. It's up there in that little town near Boston. In partnership with Grantham Institute at LSE, she manages a project on investing in a just transition, which aims to connect institutional investor action on climate with inclusive development pathways. Previously, she was director of the Capital Stewardship Program at the Service Employees International Union, that's SEIU, which was created to engage the capital markets and financial institutions in innovative ways. So please join me in welcoming Vonda to the stage.
I feel a little bit like the substitute teacher. When you walk into the class and it's your favorite professor and then you see someone different there, I can't replace Anne. And I definitely cannot do her accent and her humor, so you're stuck with me. I am proud, though, that I was, in a way, part of the origins of this book. Anne and I met Satyajit and Steve Cohen, actually, across campus years ago with a project that the RFK Center for Human Rights did, a workshop on sustainable finance. And there, we were students, along with Andrea Armeni, who you're going to hear from shortly. The three of us, I guess we were the troublemakers. We were always asking the hard questions. And instead of putting us in the corner with dunce caps, you actually welcomed our hard questions and then invited Anne to be part of this book. So I feel like there's a lesson there for asking those questions. And actually, Anne is a master of really with a laser focus, not just asking the first question, but really in her corporate engagement, going after companies and asking the second and the third until she gets them to move. And also really a brilliant organizer. She doesn't do that alone. She brings other investors along with her, which has led to her development of Climate Action 100 Plus, which also I hope you hear more about. So I'm going to just share a few remarks and hope that Anne is listening and can be with you at some future event. So it's my pleasure to be here with such a dear friend and comrade. Anne and I have worked together for a long time. It's really ironic that she's not here because it's the COVID-19 virus that is restricting travel. And that irony comes from, the fact that we live in a globalized economy and a reminder that we really share a common home. We share a common humanity. The challenges that we face don't respect national borders. The work of the Earth Institute here could not be more important. And this book could not be more timely. Our hearts go out to all those who are facing the uncertainty and the impact of this pandemic. I know that Anne is disappointed not to be joining us, but CalPERS is right to keep people on the ground. Travel restrictions have also kept her co-author in China. We miss them both, but we know that Satyajit is here for all three authors of this book, and he'll be leading a panel to discuss the ideas with leaders in the field of sustainable finance. Anne is here in spirit. Working on this book has been something that Anne has valued deeply. As she said to me, a book with authors from India, China, and Britain, if nothing else, brings together the tea-drinking nations. She also gave a suggestion to give these remarks with a full British accent. I said no. I've simply not watched enough Downton Abbey for that to be an option for someone from Michigan. Actually, I couldn't even try the accent. Anne and I have talked about the ideas in this book, and they're really the bedrock of the work that we've done together for many years. We've had long walks, many conversations, and we've traveled together in places from Findhorn, Scotland, to a very memorable trip last year down the Nile with two of our daughters. I have to confess, though, on that occasion, we were not discussing the evening's book, but we were reading Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile, which seemed a better choice for the setting. Let me share a few of the ideas that the book sets out. The first is simple, and it's in the title. Finance is an ecosystem. That means the many parts are connected in a dynamic way. We need to understand not just the parts, but the connections at work, the incentives, the messiness, the dynamism of our global financial system. This book really helps explain all that. We first need to understand the financial system as if we were to work out the potential which is there for financing sustainability, and if we are to have any hope of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. The vital importance here is of bringing financial services back to just that, to being in service to the real economy. Finance matters because, in very simple terms, that's where the money is. Governments and NGOs have only a fraction of the money which is needed to meet the challenge of the global goals. But this is not just a book about good deeds. The investors who put their money to work in the global financial system also need that shared prosperity, which can bring returns for them too. It's a financial system of mutual dependence, interconnectedness, yes, an ecosystem. Not just for financial capital, but also for human capital and our natural capital. All three are essential to our well-being. The shift in investment thinking to realize that human capital and natural capital are vital is what has driven sustainable finance to be a formidable force in the markets. Money talks. I can barely speak English, much less with a British accent. And money is talking on this. Sustainable finance can be measured in various ways, but one marker is the range of investors signed up to initiatives like the PRI or Climate Action 100+, where we now have not just millions or billions, but trillions working how to square the circle of financial returns and meeting human needs. The book makes an important case that the global financial system holds our common wealth. The growth in the global financial system has been fueled by the savings of working people around the world. These are the citizen investors whose savings are put to work in order to pay for pensions, health care, or simply for a rainy day. This is new. It's also a great opportunity to find ways to align the financial system with sustainability. These are also the people facing climate change, inequality, the collapse of ecosystems, and fearful of globalization. The book starts with mapping the financial system and helping us understand its many parts and how they connect. It looks at some history. It also gives us the practical tools for understanding how to think about finance with a sustainability lens, and in turn, to look back on finance with sustainability in mind. This sense of common purpose is the golden thread that runs through the book. The good news is that in this book, it's practical. How do you value a rainforest or think about workers' rights in finance? What about climate change and pricing of risk? Knotty problems. Here you have a crochet hook for unraveling those knots. The most important thing is that this book gives you tools, crochet hook or spreadsheet. You'll find practical help here as a student of finance, of business, or even of ethics. Hence, it's an academic text, not rhetoric. It's intended to be useful. The book is organized to be practical. It discusses the vital themes in the field of sustainable finance, the theory, the history, the various approaches, which can be deployed, and an extraordinary abundance of academic references. It provides elegant equations to bring the nebulous world of sustainability into the discipline of finance. All told, this is probably the first gathering in of all the evidence and thinking and theory on the subject of sustainable finance. You only need one book. For that, at least, it's an extraordinary effort. The inspiring event, which I was so glad to be part of, was a training program commissioned at Columbia's Earth Institute that I referenced earlier by the Robert Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights in 2013. Much work has been underway since then, and I know this book has been at least 2 years in the writing and many years in the making and learning. Anne would say that for all the scholarship and all the discussion throughout the chapters, that it finishes with some important words from her, Satyajit, and Dong. That is not just the tremendous power in finance that matters, nor the challenges that we all face. The final words of the final chapter say, "The crux of the matter lies not in what gets decided, but who gets to decide." I'll read it again. "The crux of the matter lies not in what gets decided, but in who gets to decide." That is a proposition to ponder. Sustainable finance is not just a matter of graphs and charts, goals and intentions. It's about inclusion. I know that the authors will be grateful for all of your comments and suggestions. They have written this book with humility. I also know that they are each and all very grateful for the tremendous help and advice they've had since the RFK program at Columbia, which inspired the book, and where Anne and I were so glad to take part. We can all continue to learn from each other. And in that spirit, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsie.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kelsie DeFrancia, and I'm Assistant Director of the Earth Institute's Research Program on Sustainability Policy and Management. I know you're all eagerly awaiting our panelists, but as Stephen Vonda mentioned, yet another one of our book authors and my close colleague, Dong Guo, could not be here tonight, so he asked me to read some marks on his behalf and reiterate that, like Anne, he is here in spirit. Physically, he is in China, and he shared with me that he's visited a few cities by high-speed rail, often with an entire coach to himself, which is obviously rare in such a normally crowded country. And even though he's not coming in close contact with anyone, every time he does go to a different place, he's required to self-quarantine for 14 days. Things are slowly returning to normal there, but as the virus is spreading elsewhere in the world, many people around the globe could be experiencing similar difficulties. It therefore struck him, as Vonda said, that we share a common home and a common humanity. And to achieve sustainability, we need every country to be responsible and active participants. Since our panelists tonight will focus on specific aspects of sustainable finance, I'm going to share Dong's thoughts on two broader issues that are closely connected to the major themes of the Financial Ecosystem book. While none of us may be able to accurately predict what will happen next with the coronavirus, even if a certain person in the White House claims he can, let's think for a moment about some of the reasons we're here today. The mindset of most local officials in China is still to place economic growth above all else. It's been the tested path that has powered the growth of so many Chinese cities. Although not constrained by term limits like many Western politicians, Chinese officials are still under pressure to deliver results in a relatively short period of time if they have any aspiration of rising up in the political hierarchy. So as long as GDP growth targets are still the priority at the national level, local officials will always be under pressure to deliver on that first. And long-term goals such as healthcare and education will remain political afterthoughts. Access to affordable and quality healthcare and education are perhaps the most important metrics for measuring social progress. And yet, a decade after pledging commitment to sustainable development, making ecological civilization a building block of President Xi Jinping's development strategy, and committing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, China's expenditure on education still lags behind many other developing countries and far below the average for developed countries. China's R&D expenditure, on the other hand, is now second only to the United States, as China is now leading in patent applications and competing with the US in cutting-edge cancer treatment research and artificial intelligence. But it lacks strict laws regulating the sale of wildlife animals, and sanitation and public health standards are either lacking or not strictly enforced. The coronavirus outbreak has shown that while China tries to compete in high-tech research and biomedical innovation, the most basic element of public health, disease control and prevention, is still not adequate. We have to realize that development is a multifaceted concept, which requires us to look beyond any single metric of success. We can use GDP as an important metric as long as we also incorporate indicators for environmental sustainability and social inclusion in our analysis. There is an old Chinese proverb that our moderator tonight, Satyajit Bose, likes to quote, which says, "When the knife is dull, we work hard to sharpen it. When it gets too sharp, it becomes dangerous, and we must pay attention to other aspects, such as safety." It is not to say that we shouldn't pursue economic growth, which is still very important, especially in the developing world. The problem is also not the incompatibility of economic growth with environmental sustainability. We can and we have accomplished both. The problem is that we can no longer embrace a single-minded growth at all cost model, not when our collective survival is at stake. The second point Dong wishes to make is that in order to achieve a balance between economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability, there has to be a push to be more inclusive. There is an increasing realization that the free market mechanism in the current wave of globalization is failing to regulate anti-competitive behavior. It is failing to internalize the external costs that our economic activities have on our environment and climate system. The development of the Sustainable Development Goals has demonstrated the effectiveness of a more inclusive approach. UN efforts to crowdsource new ideas from the poorest and most vulnerable segments of society in public consultations and multi-stakeholder engagement strategies generated unprecedented and widespread adoption and legitimacy for the SDGs. This inclusive, bottom-up approach, where all UN countries were engaged participants, have facilitated a new chapter in the path to a sustainable financial ecosystem, and a promise of a new era of cooperation and shared responsibility with partnerships between public policy leaders, private financial markets, and civil society. Financial decision-making has to follow a similar approach, where voices representing the value of non-financial capital, such as human and natural capital, are heard. There will inevitably be tension, conflicts of interest, and differences of opinion working towards these partnerships, but there is now a shared global ambition for sustainable development that acknowledges the role and the responsibilities of all stakeholders, not just governments. As citizens, workers, consumers, savers, managers, and investors, we all belong in the overlapping interest communities that collectively form the financial ecosystem. To improve the environmental and social impact of our economic activity, we need every pillar of society, large and small, government and private. And as Anne would have said had she was here, and as Vonda also said, the crux of the matter lies not in what gets decided, but who gets to decide. Thank you all for listening. So finally, what you've been waiting for, I'd now like to introduce our moderator for tonight's event, my colleague Satyajit Bose, Associate Professor of Practice here at Columbia, Associate Director of both our research program and the Masters in Sustainability Management program, and of course, co-author of the book, The Financial Ecosystem. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm not going to give you a long speech. I just want to say two things, really actually one thing. That is, the writing of this book is a fortunate byproduct of being part of an ecosystem of ideas. And that ecosystem of ideas would only have been possible because we were very lucky to have found two communities. The first is a community of scholarship and collegiality, and the second was the community of practice. You're going to meet some of the members of the community of practice in a second, but I just want to say one word about the community of scholarship and collegiality. That, of course, started with the RFK work, and within Columbia, the Master of Science in Sustainability Management, the Master of the MPA in Environmental Science and Policy, our research program, and particularly the faculty and the students in those programs was the community of scholarship. Many of them are here today, including the students of my class, who will be tested on this. So I want to just, for a second, say a word of thank you to everybody here. This would not have been possible without the community that started probably about 10 years ago. So thank you. Let me now introduce our distinguished panelists from our community of practice. They are the people that have kept us both rigorous and, as they say nowadays, made us keep it real. The first person that I'd like to introduce is Michelle Dunstan, who is the head of Global Responsible Investing at Alliance Bernstein. She's also a portfolio manager of 2 funds, and a person that I've come to know over the last few years as someone who truly and deeply integrates ESG considerations in a seamless way into her portfolio construction, security selection process. She was recently made the global head of responsible investing at Alliance Bernstein, and very proud and excited to see where Alliance Bernstein will go under her leadership of this aspect. So Michelle, would you come up and please take a seat? The second panelist I'd like to introduce is Krishnan Sharma. I met Krishnan today, but we've been speaking on the phone for quite a while. And Krishnan comes to us. He's the chief of the Strategic Engagement Unit in the Financing for Development Office at the United Nations. And this is the office that is tasked with making the financial ecosystem work to take out the obstacles that prevent the flow of private finance towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So he has a very critical role in this ecosystem, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about both the challenges he faces and the innovative ways in which he and his team at the UN are addressing it. So Krishnan, please come up. And our last panelist is Andrea Armeni, who was part of the original RFK workshop many years ago. Andrea is co-founder and executive director of Transform Finance, which is a nonprofit think tank exploring the intersection of finance and social change with both investors and activists. And leads the Transform Finance Investor Network, a community of practice of asset owners pursuing impact investing with a social justice approach. You would have noticed that I had to read that because it sounds very formal. It's the first time I've sort of read it, but I know Andrea very well, and I've come to respect him immensely for being a critical sounding board, both a critic and also a constructor of innovative solutions. Perhaps he's someone that really influenced us to put that last sentence into the book about listening to everybody, how the crux of the matter is not what gets decided, but who gets to decide. If anything, we've learned that, Anne, Dong, and I have learned that from Andrea. So Andrea, please come up. Michelle, I want to ask you particularly, you're a portfolio manager. You're focused on integrating ESG. You work for asset owners, investors who are presumably interested in risk-adjusted return. So to what extent is ESG a hindrance to your work?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, Alliance Bernstein, you could think of me today as the Wall Street representative. We're a large asset manager, and we manage about $650 billion of assets for various people in the form of mutual funds, institutional funds, and money for high net worth individuals. We invest in stocks, bonds, other particular instruments. And that's a question we get asked a lot, and the answer we would say is not at all. So what we do is across all our actively managed portfolios, we integrate ESG. And we do that because we think it makes good business sense and because we think it turns into better financial outcomes for our clients and lets us make better decisions. So let me give you a very tangible example. So if you're thinking about a company, take an industrial company, for instance, that emits carbon. Is carbon taxed in the jurisdictions in which it operates? If it is, you know what? You should be incorporating that in your cash flow statement and thinking about that when you're making an investment decision. If carbon isn't taxed today, could it be taxed at some point in the next 2 or 3 years? You can make a reasonable assumption about if it could, what's the probability, how much is that going to cost? Include that in your analysis. Even if there's no possibility it's going to become taxed, could regulations change so that this company is going to have to install scrubbers or upgrade its equipment? That should be in the capital expenditures of that company and included in your decision. Even if that's not going to be the case, could the customers of this company make different decisions? Is there a lower carbon alternative out there that their customers are going to move and buy from a different competitor? That should be in your analysis. Or even if that's not going to happen, what about the employees? Are employees going to make different decisions about where they want to work? Royal Dutch Shell is now the number 8th most popular firm for new engineering grads to work for in the Netherlands. It's always been number 1, occasionally number 2 behind Philips. I can't name 6 other engineering firms in the Netherlands. What does that mean for Royal Dutch Shell's operational know-how, for their future technology and innovation if they can't get the top engineering grads anymore? All of that should be incorporated in your investment decision-making. It's not really thinking about this from a, fuzzy kind of perspective. These have real tangible consequences on the companies themselves. And when you're thinking about, is this company a good investment? These are all things you need to take into account when you're doing that. And that's what we call integration. Thinking about holistically all aspects of a firm, today's financials, tomorrow's financials, and how that might intersect with the rapidly changing world of ESG, climate change, regulation, all those types of things.
Thank you, Michelle. So, Krishnan, you heard from Michelle about the importance of thinking about the environmental and social and governance factors within the investment process. Now, you're tasked with working out how to get private capital to mobilize to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Why is private capital important to addressing those goals or achieving those goals?
Sure, thanks very much, Satyajit, and it's a pleasure to be here. Achieving the SDGs and implementing the 2030 agenda requires an immense amount of resources. The estimates vary, but usually they're in the range of about 3 to 5 trillion per annum just for developing countries alone. Now, it's clear that public finance, while still of critical importance, is not going to be sufficient to achieve this. At the same time, private finance is very important, but has not been utilized to the degree that it should be. If you look at the entire size of the private investor market, it's about $270 trillion, of which only about $30 trillion, admittedly huge amounts nevertheless, is devoted to sustainable and responsible investment. So there's considerable scope to increasing the role of private finance in sustainable development. And moreover, much of this needs to be long-term. However, achieving this, while important, is still a complex task, and it ultimately hinges on incentives. Ultimately, for private finance to be sustainable and to have impact, the incentives of private investors needs to be aligned with sustainable development. And we're talking about incentives of 4 broad sets of actors: institutional investors, commercial banks, capital market operators, and often forgotten non-financial corporations. And often we're not just talking about individual incentives of these actors. Like if you look at the institutional investors, we can speak about many individual incentives. You can speak about fiduciary responsibilities. We can speak about the interactions between asset owners and asset managers, compensation, a whole range of factors. We're also talking about the interaction and the interface of these incentives. Let me just give you an example. If you look at the ownership of corporate equities in the US, around the 1960s and 1970s, about 70% of this ownership was by retail investors. Today, it's flipped across. It's about 80% by financial investors. And to an increasing degree, sometimes financial investors with short-term horizons. At the same time as this trend has happened, we're also seeing a trend in corporate investment, which is becoming increasingly short-term. And we're also seeing some form of divorce in the relationship between profits and investment. So what we're dealing with here, Satyajit, are really incentives of core actors, and not just the incentives, but also the interrelationship between these incentives. That's where policy must really focus on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Krishnan. So Michelle talked to us about private capital, why you'd want to incorporate ESG into that investment process. Krishnan just outlined the difficulties of aligning private capital with the needs of development priorities. I want to ask Andrea. Now, Andrea, your Transform Finance is very much focused on changing the financial ecosystem, for example, to bring in the kind of capital that doesn't necessarily need a financial return. Is that kind of capital absolutely essential, and why? Why can't private capital achieve everything?
Thank you, Satyajit. There is extremely little capital at the moment that is not looking for a traditional market rate of return. So we need to use that amount quite carefully to crowd in other types of capital, to de-risk opportunities, to prove new markets. The way in which we think about the transformation of the financial ecosystem is really based on what we were saying before, that finance is fairly unique in the way that it touches everything else. You could have an ecosystem of media, an ecosystem of fashion. They don't really influence everything else in the world. And it's made up of a set of tools and a set of incentives. The tools themselves can be considered fairly neutral, but historically, at least if we look at this past century of finance, they have decoupled from the real economy. Right, the growth in financialization, the growth in finance for the sake of returns in themselves. So that's the first piece that we would look at. Mm-hmm. How can one rein in the negative impacts of capital in the real world? What is there that can be done? And I think the ESG approach of taking into account and incorporating in investment decisions considerations on environment, social factors, and governance factors is a first step, but it doesn't quite get us far enough. And that's where the transformative piece comes in. We believe that capital, like any other tool, is an ingredient for social change if deployed in that way. That's the part that has been explored a little bit less. And I think that's the case because generally it doesn't line up as smoothly with a return thesis, the first piece. There are some obvious things, right? You turn off the lights at night, you save on the electricity bill, and it's good for the environment. Other things might be more of a zero-sum game where you have to give up something for other stakeholders. And you can do it because this is the next layer, because you believe that ultimately it will drive better returns, as Michelle was saying, because the employees will be happier, will be easier to attract and to retain talent. Or you could do it out of the realization that, going back to the closing sentence in your book, while finance affects everything, it's only the holders of capital and the managers of capital that get to decide for the rest of us. And it's not an even distribution around the population who gets to be an investor and who gets to make those decisions. So our attempt is really to say, can we tweak that equation in a way that is consistent with the financial ecosystem as we have it now, right? We're not sitting down and trying to design something from scratch, but the reform will have to be, I think, a lot more radical than what we have thought so far. I'll give you one example on this. At one edge of ESG, you will find impact investments, right? Investments that are trying to achieve both a financial return and a social or environmental outcome. Now, if we start from the premise of where we are today in terms of wealth distribution or access to investment opportunities, and we pursue impact investments with a traditional thesis around the returns, wealth inequality will continue to increase. Access to opportunities will continue to decrease. And this means that even while we solve punctual, specific problems through the deployment of capital, we're not working at the ecosystemic problem of capital becoming a more powerful source, and fewer people being the ones that get to make those decisions.
Thanks, Andrea. So I think one thing, Andrea is also a faculty member at NYU, and he teaches deeply on these subjects. So I want to talk about the training needs, because, of course, that's the business that we're in. I'm talking my book, as they say in finance. Michelle, what kinds of training needs does a standard portfolio manager, you're not a standard portfolio manager, but the standard portfolio manager who's used to modern portfolio theory, CAPM, factor models, what kind of new sources of information, new training would they need in order to thrive in this world of incorporating climate risk and opportunity, or ESG, or addressing the SDGs, or bringing in the voices that Andrea is talking about?
A lot, because a lot of these issues haven't really been considered before. So we do have to provide a range of training, and that ranges from internal training programs on everything from what do good executive compensation packages look like, to modern slavery, to forced labor in your supply chain and other things. We also have to provide them with a bunch of tools. We do have proprietary systems for helping analysts and portfolio managers engage with companies, ask the right questions to figure out on issues, and forums for them to discuss these issues. We have an expert team of ESG analysts who are experts in the E, the environmental and climate part, the social part, and the governance part, where if our analysts or portfolio managers run into issues that they're not particularly familiar with, those resources can serve as someone to bounce ideas off of, provide guidance, even help them engage with the companies, and then incorporate it into their analysis. One of the more innovative programs that we have is our partnership with the Earth Institute at Columbia University. So just over a year ago, we kicked off our relationship, and what we've developed jointly is a client science curriculum. And it includes everything from basic climate science, what is climate change, what are the impacts on sea level rise, to things on the policy and legal frameworks that are coming out of it, to presentations which Dr. Bose has been heavily involved in on how do you think about incorporating that in your financial analysis. So what we've committed to doing, and we're probably about 3/4 of the way through right now, is every single investor in our firm, all the analysts and portfolio managers, are going to undergo this climate change training program. We think it's critical that they understand the issues and are able to at least ask the questions or know where to go for more information. So we're finishing that right now, and now we're trying to figure out what phase 2 is, which is probably deeper research that we're going to conduct together in partnership with Columbia.
That's great. Krishnan, so tell me, you outlined why we need private capital. So what are the bottlenecks to preventing private capital of the kind, say, that Michelle is talking about, or others, that's perhaps more passive and less focused on ESG? How do you get that in? What are the obstacles to getting that in?
Sure. So once again, the obstacles to really sort of scaling up private capital for sustainable development, private capital that is aligned to sustainable development, really centers around, as I mentioned earlier, incentives. I think ultimately the key is incentives, and incentives of those 4 major players.
Just to interrupt you, Andrea also mentioned the tension between the short term and the long term, and I think you probably have something to say about it.
Exactly, and I think one common denominator to aligning those incentives is long-termism. The longer the term horizon, the more likely that ESG factors, SDG factors, will become more and more material to the financial interests of the company. So I think long-termism is a critical factor in all of this. And with long-termism in mind, what's really important is to look at 4 broad sets of areas, I think. The first is sort of looking at sort of financial incentives, the whole range of financial incentives, and once again keeping long-termism in mind, including longer-term performance benchmarks, longer-term performance metrics, disclosure. Though I think reporting and disclosure is extremely important, but is important only to a degree that investors are incentivized to really use those reports. At the same time, we need to look at the broader range of corporate incentives, once again, longer-term metrics, benchmarks, and also the whole issue of quarterly reporting systems. We recently had a capstone study undertaken by students at Columbia University who came up with some interesting sort of recommendations on quarterly reporting systems. While once again admitting that these are essential for transparency, we could perhaps look at rolling formats in addition to the standard quarterly systems as well. That will give a better measure of longer-term performance and incentivize investment managers. But having said that, the point I think made by Michelle and also by Andrea is also about pricing and externalities. Even when you address those two factors, you have to get relative prices right for investors to invest in the right projects. So you need to price in externalities. And finally, even when you've done all of those factors, investors still may not invest in certain regions of the world because of risk-return considerations. And this is why investment platforms, tools, the whole area of blended finance, risk mitigation also comes in. So it needs to be looked at in a more integrated way. Thanks.
Yeah. So, all of you have been talking about some disembodied concepts, for example, externalities or the long term. And in many ways, behind those terms like externalities, behind the long term, there are voices, little voices, right? And so, Andrea, I really want to ask you about this. Your work has focused on this critical challenge of bringing in the least heard voices into the financial ecosystem. Can you give us some examples or talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, happy to do so. And I will start by picking up on the point about the trainings, perhaps.
Sure.
Because I think that one of the reasons why we have ended up where we are now is because of this deep disconnect that there is between the world of capital and the rest of the world, and the world of activism and the world of capital. And maybe as an Italian, I'm still traumatized by the old mass in Latin, but oftentimes the world of finance comes across as such, right? There's somebody up there making decisions in a language that you don't understand. And the work has to happen on both sides. I think that's one piece that activists often miss. So through programs like the Alliance Bernstein one that Michelle mentioned, it's important for those that make investment decisions to understand environmental and social factors. But I think that those that are more progressive have done a disservice historically by shunning finance as a worthwhile arena of social change. Saying, no, I'm too good, I'm too holy for engaging with finance. And instead saying, hedge funds are evil, which might well be the case, right? But it's not going to get you very far. And those that are in hedge funds clearly don't care about your moral stance on them quite as much. So that means that there need to be translation opportunities. There needs to be sufficient training also on for the social side actors or for the environmental side actors to be able to interact meaningfully with finance, to be able to come in and say something that is potentially actionable. And that means understanding the constraints, understanding some of the potential entry points so that you go and bark up the right tree and you know what kind of leverage you need to bring to open that conversation. And I will say, Anne, whom I missed dearly today, is probably the master at that, at figuring out where the entry point is and where the change can happen.
That's the crochet hook she mentioned.
That is very much the crochet hook.
The crochet hook to cut the Gordian knot is what she said.
And now, in terms of bringing in the voices, there was an early wave, I think, of co-design, where you would see, in particular in the global South and in emerging markets, you would see investors saying, let's see let's do some consultation with the local population. Generally in a way that was geared, however, to the success of the project itself, right? It was a de-risking of the project, as opposed to really ensuring that the outcomes were going to be positive outcomes for that community. Our thesis, which is a little bit niche, I will acknowledge, is that there should be a sharing of governance for this to be meaningful. So if a certain flow of capital is affecting my community, all the more so if you purport to be doing something good, then that community should have a governance aspect to it. Because of a fundamental, I think, internalization of those externalities, right? The incentives are misaligned if the ones that get to decide are only the ones that are reaping the financial return, oftentimes the short-term financial return, as opposed to the ones that get to live it every day.
So that's a good point that you bring up. Michelle, let me ask you about this, because I think, at some level, if you're running a business, surely it's a no-brainer that, your customers have to be happy, your employees have to be happy, the communities in which you operate have to be happy, right? And is ESG simply a good way of running businesses, and the investor is the most powerful stakeholder, as Andrea says, to try to implement that?
It's both. Like I mentioned, across all our portfolios, we think, why would you exclude looking at certain factors when you're considering an investment? You want to consider everything. But if you think about our business, all of our actively managed funds integrate. We also have a set of what we call portfolios with purpose, and that's for people who want to invest beyond just risk and return. Each one of them have specific ESG goals. They're currently a small part of our business, but they're a very rapidly growing part of our business. So if you look at the ecosystem out there, people, particularly younger people, want to invest more for the just risk and return. So this is something that I think is going to grow over time. As more people feel the effects of climate change, they see that they can make a difference, and their own personal belief system wants that. So as an investment manager, we have to deliver products that our clients want. For some people, that's integration. For other people, it goes beyond that. The other power that we have, we're stewards of large amounts of capital. I talk with CEOs, board members, CFOs on a weekly basis. I can exert my power for change. So if I have a conversation with a particular company to say, hey, look, you guys are doing this, I don't want to invest in you because I think that's bad for society and bad for your business, they can change. And we engage with these companies. We tell them, here's what we want to see from you, and here's why we think it's a win-win for everyone. And if a lot of asset managers continue to do that, we can drive change because we're the people with the money. They want our business. They want us to invest in those stocks. They're going to, if they think it's right, do what we want them to do. So we can actually wield a lot of influence in this process.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here, and we're almost out of time, and I do want to leave just a few minutes at least for questions from the audience. One thing that I do want to say is that even at the Earth Institute, in our research program, the Sustainability Management Program, our training efforts, we've had to address the needs of all those stakeholders that are less heard. In our travels, particularly for Dong and I, in our travels around the world, particularly in the developing countries, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, we've had many people come and say, hey, we want access to those financial skills that you're providing, and we can't move to New York for a year. That's not feasible. And so, we resisted for a long time the push to make this content available online. And we're launching this online certificate in sustainable finance primarily because of the demands of people that we've met who've said, hey, we can't go to New York. We might come there for a few days, but we have work to do in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, in Khartoum, in Sudan, in Hong Kong or Shenzhen or Bangkok. So it takes us a lot of time to get to that. I want to end there, but also let you guys ask questions because we also would like to let our panelists give them a break so they can have a wine and a beer afterwards. So any questions? I think we might have time for two. There's a hand up there and another hand up there. The gentleman in the black jacket.
Hi, my name is Mike Schwartz. I'm a sustainability consultant at Flag. Thank you all. You spoke a bit about the tension between short-term and long-term and what it would look like if investors were paying attention more to long-term. Are you seeing those trends? And Michelle, to your point of the power that you have, is it just you? How many portfolio managers are pushing the companies they're investing in, and what is it taking to move that needle?
Yeah. So on Wall Street, we're pretty long-term. Some of our portfolios look 3 to 5 years out. A lot of these issues are becoming material over that. So for us, long-term time horizon, a lot of this is easier for us than it is for our colleagues that are short-term oriented or hedge funds. And we are doing that. So a lot of our portfolio companies are very receptive because we are very attractive shareholders. We're long-term oriented. We engage with them on their strategy, not what's going to happen in the next quarter. They also often look to us for advice, and they have for years on things like, do you think my strategy is right? Do you think this is a good move for my business? They want our advice on that, and now they're looking to our advice on their ESG policies. But I would say we have it a little bit easier to be able to incorporate this because it's more material for us than, say, a hedge fund whose holding period is measured in hours or days.
Do you guys want to respond?
Thanks very much. To me, that's still long-termism remains a critically important issue. If you look at institutional investors, look at the longer term, the ones with the longer term liabilities like pension funds. If you look at the amount that they invest in infrastructure of their assets, it's about 3% of their assets. So it's about sort of converting a long-term sort of financial situation into a long-term investment. Now, what we're doing at the United Nations is that the Secretary General has formed an alliance of 30 CEOs called the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, whose task, it's a diverse alliance from across the world, whose task is to look at the obstacles to enhancing long-term finance and investment for sustainable development. It's not to invest money themselves, but look at what are the obstacles. Are they regulatory? Are they institutional? Are they other incentive-based? And how they can devise solutions for addressing that. So to us, that's still a very critical issue and one that we're working on.
Okay, we have one more question in the back there. I think there's a mic.
Thanks again for the time. This question I won't point it towards Andrea, but I'd love anyone's response. I'd like to put focus on private equity, specifically early-stage startups in the emerging markets, or just social ventures. It seems at the center of the bottleneck in terms of money flowing towards impact initiatives is there to a certain extent. So my question is, do you see solutions out there right now that are addressing this in a way that works? And if not, if you could wield a magic wand and design a solution, what would that be?
Great question.
I'll start with the magic wand, which would be the abolition of venture capital, in particular for emerging markets. And I say it as a bit of a controversial quip, but one of the considerations that I very much like coming out of the UN in crowding in private capital has been to say, well, actually, the lack of capital is not the problem. The lack of aligned capital, the lack of responsible capital is more the issue. And in the case of venture capital, early stage private equity, again, they are tools that kind of make sense intuitively, but they've gone a little bit off the rails, going back to the incentives conversation. With respect to venture capital, it is a winner-take-all strategy. It is one in which a portfolio manager has baked in the failure of at least 7 out of the 10 enterprises, let's say, and they're fine, right? They will get the returns, they will still have a job, and they will still have a roof over their head. The other 7, the actual entrepreneurs for whom that fails, probably will not fare as well. The workers there will not fare as well. The communities that were counting on that, on the work of those enterprises will not fare as well. So the risk allocation there is a little bit of a problem. Now, we need early stage capital. We've been quite active in the development of alternative deal structures for early stage investment. So anything from redeemable equity that doesn't require a big exit event, revenue-based financing, royalty-based financing. So there's a lot of capital out there that can be tweaked a little bit within the instruments that are available right now. On the private equity side, maybe touching on the domestic U.S. situation, which we had talked about in the preparation for this, we've been very interested in what if you took private equity, given that it is an allocation for all the pension funds and for all the institutional investors, and you try to find something that is not predicated on extraction or kind of destruction, but still relies on that inherent disruption that comes from private equity at the enterprise leverage buyout side. And I think it's quite innovative and can be applied to other areas. In this case, it would be using the tools of a leveraged buyout to convert a company to employee ownership. So having a retiring business person or in a closely held business, they want to get out. One of the opportunities that they would have would be to sell the business to the employees. It's tax advantaged in the United States. There's a long history to it. It's also a bit of a pain in the neck to do, and the seller has to stay involved, right? They normally get a seller note. If you insert a private equity vehicle that buys these companies, but the ultimate exit is not to another PE fund or to a strategic acquirer, but turns it over to the employees, right, using the free cash flow from the company to repay the private equity investment, and then putting it all into an ESOP trust where the company ends up with it. I'm just using that as an example that the tools themselves can be used in very different ways. There's nothing, God-given about them. It will take a lot more innovative thinking or edgy thinking, I think, than just saying, let's make more private equity, more venture capital flow into the communities where it hasn't historically been.
Yeah, and I think, so that's a great place for us to end, because one thing I want to emphasize is that the purpose of our book and also our programs, including the online program, is to democratize access to the skills that are necessary to make those kinds of private equity or any financial structure available for social purpose. So I want to end there. We'll all be around for wine and beer and hors d'oeuvres, so please stick around and ask questions. Thank you very much all for listening. And thank you to our panelists.